He only asked 2 cops to stop littering. Instead of a warning, he got threats, a false arrest, and a boot to the face. They thought they had all the power. They thought the report would cover everything, but they picked the wrong man. Want to see how the system turned against them instead? Watch till the end, and drop a comment with your city. Don't forget to subscribe. The road stretched out before him like a quiet ribbon of fading daylight, the kind of highway that felt almost sacred at this hour, when the world was caught between the dying glow of sunset and the first breath of night. Chuck rode with the steady calm of a man who had spent years learning how to listen to the road, to the engine, to the wind, and to whatever was waiting beyond the next bend. His motorcycle moved like an extension of his own will, loud enough to exist, quiet enough not to demand attention. The chrome had lost its showroom shine long ago, replaced not by neglect but by miles, weather, and stories. Everything about the bike said the same thing Chuck did without words: useful, honest, and still here. He had just left a charity event for veterans, the kind he never turned down because he could not forget the faces or the hands of the men who had shaken his own that night. Some of them had been younger than his boots, others older than the sky. He had signed shirts, shaken hands, listened to stories, funny ones, dark ones, half-whispered ones, and he never once rushed anyone. He never did when it came to them. Those were the only crowds he didn't mind. The kinds of crowds that understood silence, scars, and the weight of real things. Now the echo of that night still lingered in his mind as he rode. The air smelled of dry grass, cooling asphalt, and the faint sweetness of late summer. A truck passed in the opposite direction, headlights cutting briefly across his visor before receding into the distance. Crickets sang loud enough to be heard even over the engine. Far off, the horizon still held on to a bruise of orange, but the world around him was already settling into blue and gray. It was the kind of quiet that reminded him why he preferred the road over cities. Nothing out here lied, nothing pretended. He wasn't in a hurry. That was the strange kind of privilege he had these days. Not wealth, not fame, but time he actually knew how to use. The road was the road. Home would still be there when he arrived. It was only by chance that he noticed the patrol car. At first, it was just a shape up ahead on the shoulder, a white and blue silhouette sitting with its doors open, interior lights glowing like a small campfire in the darkening world. Chuck would have ridden past it without thinking twice. Cops sitting in a parked cruiser on the highway wasn't exactly rare, but something else caught his eye. There was trash on the ground outside the vehicle. Not a couple of things, but a scattered pile, crushed cans, torn wrappers, an energy drink bottle thrown carelessly into the grass, another lying half on the asphalt. Then as he approached, he saw one of the officers inside the car casually toss another piece of trash out the window. A candy wrapper fluttered in the fading light before landing among the others. Chuck rode past them another 20 yards before slowing down. He could have kept going. Nobody would have blamed him. Not a single person would ever know that he had seen 2 uniformed officers sitting in their cruiser, treating the roadside like their personal dumpster. It wasn't his jurisdiction, wasn't his fight, wasn't his responsibility. But responsibility wasn't something he ever let go of just because nobody was watching. He made a slow U-turn, rolled gently back toward them, and eased to a stop with the engine rumbling beneath him. He didn't take off his helmet yet. People sometimes reacted differently to a face than to a voice, and he preferred to gauge them first. The officers didn't seem to notice, or didn't care, until he shut off the engine. The sudden silence made his presence harder to ignore. The younger officer in the passenger seat looked over first. He had the kind of expression Chuck had seen before. The quick assessment of superiority, the silent, "Oh, this guy." The older one behind the wheel took longer, turning his head with the heavy, slow confidence of someone who had gone unchallenged long enough to forget what challenge even felt like. Chuck spoke with the kind of calm that didn't need volume to be heard. "Evening, officers. Not trying to bother you. Just thought you might want to pick up what you've thrown out there. Highway crews work hard enough already." For a moment, neither man said anything. The younger officer smirked. The older one chewed slowly, like a man who believed he had all the time in the world. The younger one cracked the first response. You serious right now, old-timer? Chuck didn't change tone. Serious enough to turn around and say it. You see a sign that says this road belongs to you? The younger officer asked, leaning halfway out of the window, like a teenager picking a fight in a parking lot. No, Chuck replied evenly, but I didn't see one that said it's a dumping ground either. The older officer finally spoke, voice low and slow. You got somewhere to be, sir? Home, Chuck answered. Eventually. That earned a snort from the younger one. Then here's an idea, keep riding. Chuck finally removed his helmet, letting his face catch what little light was left in the sky. No anger, no raised brows, just a steady gaze, the kind that had turned plenty of men quiet without a fist being raised. I'm just asking you to respect the uniform you're wearing, he said, voice steady. Nothing more. Something in that sentence, maybe the word respect, maybe the tone shifted the mood. The younger officer's smirk faded into something sharper. The older one's chewing stopped. The silence hung just long enough to make the air feel heavier. Then came the line that always showed exactly what kind of men they were dealing with. You know what? The older officer said, opening his door and stepping out. Why don't you step off the bike? We can talk somewhere that isn't in the middle of the road. The younger one got out too, shutting his door harder than he needed to. The interior light snapped off, leaving only the faint glow of headlights in the deepening dusk. Chuck didn't move immediately. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't reckless either. This wasn't a bar argument. These men had badges, weapons, and power, and they were used to wielding it without question. He knew the type. The badge didn't make a man good or bad. It just made the truth harder to hide. He got off the bike slowly, setting the kickstand, keeping his hands visible, every motion controlled. Not submissive, just clear. The air felt different now. The earlier calm of the road was gone, replaced by the low rumble of something waiting to become trouble. One of the officers kicked a can on the ground as he approached. The aluminum rattled against the pavement and spun to a stop. Chuck had seen enough signs to know exactly where this was headed, but he said nothing yet. Men who wanted to prove something always revealed themselves first. The older officer stopped a few feet away and gave Chuck a long, slow look top to boots back to face. Let's see some ID, since you want to get involved in police matters. That was how it began. Not with shouting, not with fists. Just the first step in a game where they set the rules because they believed they owned the board. And Chuck, calm as ever, knew exactly what kind of storm he had just chosen to walk into. And he did not regret turning back, not even for a second. The air had grown noticeably cooler by the time Chuck stood beside his motorcycle. The last traces of sunlight fading into a muted violet that left the world half lit and half shadowed. The officers had taken positions that were not accidental. They didn't stand casually or with the relaxed authority of men simply doing their job. They positioned themselves like animals who believed the ground already belonged to them. One slightly ahead, one circling a step behind, both closing the space just enough to force Chuck into the center, without ever saying so. He had seen it before. Men who enjoyed the power of the moment more than the purpose of the badge. Men who didn't want to serve the law, only the feeling of being above it. The older officer, who had been the first to step out of the cruiser, held out his hand for the ID with a slackness that pretended patience, but pulsed with condescension. Chuck handed over his wallet without comment. The man didn't even glance at the card before speaking. Long way from home, aren't you? He asked, voice low, tone coated in assumed authority. I didn't say where home was, Chuck replied simply. You didn't have to, the younger one said, circling halfway behind Chuck, as if inspecting him like an object. You look like the type who lives outside city limits. Barbecue, tools in the garage, old country records on the shelf. Know how I know? He leaned closer, wearing the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. Because only people who don't live around here think they can ride up and tell cops what to do. Chuck didn't move, didn't turn. His breathing was steady, but he paid attention to the exact distance of every footstep, every shift of weight. He had learned long ago that trouble rarely announced its arrival. It telegraphed itself quietly in stance, in movement, in the way a voice changed when someone decided they didn't need to pretend anymore. The older officer finally looked at the ID, his eyes widening just slightly, not in recognition, but in annoyance. Recognition would have softened him or made him more careful. Annoyance meant something else. It meant he didn't like the idea that this man might not fit into the box he had already placed him in. "You been drinking?" the officer asked, flicking the ID back with 2 fingers, not handing it, tossing it. "No," Chuck answered. "Came from a charity run. Veterans fundraiser." "Oh," the younger officer mocked. "A real hero on a Harley. Bet they just loved you." Then, without waiting for a reply, he stepped toward the motorcycle and ran his hand along the handlebar, not to examine it, but to mark it like a vandal testing property that wasn't his. Chuck's hand twitched, not from anger, but instinct. You didn't touch a man's bike like that. Not unless you wanted a reaction. "Don't do that," Chuck said, still calm. The younger officer didn't stop. He reached the side mirror, gripped it, and without hesitation, bent it backward with deliberate force. The crack of stressed metal echoed louder than his laugh. Chuck didn't raise his voice. "I asked you to stop." "You asked," the younger one replied, turning just far enough to look Chuck in the eye. "And we decided we don't take orders from you." The older officer took a slow step closer, arms folded, chin up. "Got an issue with how we're conducting this stop, sir?" His voice was steady, but it carried threat. Not because of what he could do, but because of who would believe him afterward. Chuck's eyes flicked briefly to the side mirror, now hanging at the wrong angle, then back to the officer's face. "I have an issue with you damaging private property for no reason." "There's a reason," the younger one said, kicking lightly at the bike tire. "We're checking it for violations, which I'm already seeing. Tires look worn. Mirrors aren't regulation. Tail light might be too dim. Pipes look loud. We can go all night if you want." That was the turning point, the moment when the interaction shifted from false courtesy to open degradation. They weren't trying to hide it anymore. They wanted him to see it. They wanted him to accept it. Chuck had dealt with authority before. Real authority. Generals, commanders, men who earned respect by carrying burdens, not by hiding behind badges. What stood in front of him now wasn't authority. It was ego dressed in uniform. The younger officer kicked the kickstand just enough to unbalance the motorcycle, and the bike toppled sideways into the dirt with a dull, pained thud. Metal hit gravel. The world seemed to pause just long enough for the disrespect to register fully. Chuck looked down at the bike, then up again. "I'm going to ask one more time," he said slowly. "Stop damaging my property." The older officer gave a mock frown. "Is that a threat?" "No," Chuck said. "It's a warning." The younger officer laughed, stepping close enough for Chuck to smell the cheap artificial citrus of his gum. "You're not in a bar, old man. You don't get to swing first here. We do. And then we get to write the report." There it was, the part they always said eventually. Not out of necessity, out of pleasure. The older officer leaned in, voice quieter and colder than before. "We can say whatever we need to say. Suspect became aggressive. Suspect resisted search. Suspect attempted to strike an officer. You know how fast that sticks once it's written down. Long time since you've been on the receiving end of paperwork, I bet." Chuck didn't blink. "You're not even pretending this is lawful." "Oh, it's lawful," the officer said, "because we'll say it is." That was the first time Chuck felt a shift inside himself. Not anger, not fear, but that precise moment when patience stops being a virtue and becomes a liability. He knew the line. He had spent years staying on the right side of it. But there were men in this world who mistook restraint for weakness, and those men always walked too far. The younger officer stepped behind him just enough to enter his blind angle. "Maybe we should pat him down again," he said, voice dripping with mock interest. "You never know what kind of things bikers hide on them. Knives, substances, illegal mods. Hell, maybe you're pushing dope across state lines." The older one didn't object. In fact, he took a step closer, invading Chuck's personal space just enough to make refusal a challenge. "Hands on the seat. Let's do a full search." Chuck didn't move. "On what grounds?" The officer smiled as if the question itself was amusing. "You're being uncooperative. That's enough grounds." The younger one let out a short, bitter chuckle. "And resisting the search? That'd be even better for us. Don't push it, Grandpa." They were trying to bait him, not into violence, into anything that could be written down as justification. One raised voice, one wrong movement, one defensive instinct, and the report would write itself. He had dealt with this kind of power abuse before, just not from men wearing American badges. He looked at the fallen bike again, not with sadness but with calculation. The mirror could be repaired. The paint could be redone. But this moment, this was the line they were willing to cross, and they believed there'd be no cost. The younger officer took another step in, too close, reaching for Chuck's jacket like he had the right to handle him. That was when Chuck decided the moment had gone far enough. Not for the bike, not even for himself, but because the look in their eyes told him they had done this before and expected to do it again. He lifted his gaze, calm but entirely different now. There was no anger in it, no threat, just certainty. The kind of certainty that made lesser men flinch without understanding why. The younger officer didn't flinch because he still believed he held control. And that was the last mistake he made before the night took a direction neither of them were prepared for. The older officer shifted his stance, ready to escalate. The younger one reached again for Chuck's jacket, and somewhere in the brief, quiet space between breath and motion, the balance began to change. Slowly, silently, unstoppably. Next came the part they never saw coming, not because it was concealed, but because they never imagined the man in front of them was capable of more than patience, and they never imagined patience might end. The moment the younger officer reached for Chuck's jacket again, the last traces of pretense dissolved from the scene. There was no more illusion of procedure, no more hint of professionalism. The officers had crossed the threshold from authority into territory they believed belonged solely to them, territory where their word rewrote reality, where power was not granted by duty but taken through intimidation. The night around them seemed to sense the shift. The crickets quieted, the wind stilled, and even the road felt like it was holding its breath. The older officer didn't wait any longer. He took a single step closer, his boot grinding into the dirt beside the fallen motorcycle, and then, with a suddenness meant to stun and humiliate more than injure, he raised his leg and kicked Chuck in the face. The impact came fast and hard, the toe of the heavy-duty police boot connecting just below the cheekbone. The world flashed white for a second, not from pain alone, but from the shock of how casually the blow had been delivered, without warning, without cause, and without hesitation. Chuck staggered back a half step, not falling, but forced to absorb the full force through balance and instinct. The taste of blood touched his tongue, metallic and thin, the sting of a torn inner lip. The older officer exhaled like a man finishing a chore. "That's one charge already," he muttered, resisting verbal instruction. The younger one stepped in behind Chuck, grabbing his wrist and twisting it sharply up and back, trying to force it into a hold. "Hands behind your back," he snapped, though his tone carried none of the formal announcement of an arrest-only satisfaction that he finally had physical leverage. Chuck didn't move yet. He let the grip exist for a brief moment, memorizing pressure, angle, weight. He had learned long ago not to react before he understood all variables. Reacting too soon was survival on instinct. Reacting at the right time was survival with outcome. "You're under detention," the younger officer said, tightening the hold. "You don't get to ask why. You just get to comply." Chuck spoke calmly, voice quiet but controlled. "What is the legal basis for the detention?" The younger one laughed under his breath. "You think this is a classroom? You don't get to quiz us." Chuck turned his head enough to meet the older officer's eyes. "If you're detaining me, you're required to state why." The older officer stepped closer, his voice low and full of certainty. "We don't need to explain anything. Not when you just assaulted an officer by refusing to follow orders." Chuck inhaled once, slow, deep, the kind of breath that didn't belong to fear or anger, but to clarity. The younger officer shoved him forward, trying to push him against the seat of his fallen bike. "Lean down, hands behind you." Chuck didn't resist, not yet, but he did speak. "You keep talking like that," he said quietly, "because you think no one's going to hold you accountable." "And who's going to do that?" the younger one asked, tightening his grip so hard it was meant to bruise. "You?" The older officer smirked, arms folded. "Let me explain it slow since you're not picking it up. We can break your nose, drag you in, write that you were violent, And the only thing the report will show is two officers doing their job. He leaned in closer, voice nearly a whisper. And nobody will care. Because nobody ever does. That was the part that mattered, the truth behind everything they had done. They weren't acting out of fear or stress or even tempers. They were acting out of certainty that they were untouchable, that the badge erased fault, that the system bent to the ones who controlled the paperwork. Then came the final confirmation of intent. The older officer nodded to the younger one. Put him down if he moves. We'll say he swung first. That was when Chuck knew the line wasn't just crossed, it had been burned. There was no possible resolution left that involved words. The officers weren't threatening what they might do. They had already begun doing it, and they were confident that the law would bow to their version. The younger officer yanked harder, forcing Chuck's arm higher, waiting for pain to force compliance or retaliation. You know what's funny? He muttered. Guys like you always think you get a say. But the moment we write the report, you disappear into the paragraph that says non-compliant suspect. That's it. That's all you become. Chuck's gaze lowered briefly to the dirt, to the scattered trash, to the dented fuel tank of the bike he had taken care of for years. Nothing in his posture shifted. Nothing in his body looked like resistance. But something inside him, quiet and cold and unshakable, clicked into place. He looked up again, not with anger, with decision. I'm only going to say this once, Chuck said, voice so calm it silenced even the younger officer's smirk. Stop what you're doing, the younger officer scoffed. Or what? The older one leaned in, face inches from Chuck's. Or you'll file a complaint? Call a lawyer? We'll have that stamped and buried before you even make it out on bail, old man. Chuck didn't blink. No. Then came the quiet sentence that fell heavier than a shout, because it wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Or you're going to regret what happens next. The officers laughed. Both of them. Because they still believed they were in control. Because they still believed violence used under a badge wasn't violence at all. Because they still believed they were the only danger in the dark. And because they still had no idea who they had laid hands on. The younger one adjusted his stance, ready to force the arm lock harder. The older one shifted his weight, preparing to strike again if necessary. And in the stillness between that movement and the next, the final moment of imbalance arrived. The last instant before the world they controlled would hand control to someone else. Chuck didn't move yet, but the second he did, the night would not belong to them anymore. It would belong to consequence, theirs. The shift happened so quietly that neither officer recognized the moment when control stopped belonging to them. There was no dramatic stance, no raised voice, no sudden explosive movement. All that changed at first was Chuck's posture. His shoulders eased instead of tensing. His breathing slowed instead of quickening. And the look in his eyes, once patient and restrained, became something altogether different. Clear, precise, and utterly unafraid. It was the look of a man who had measured the situation fully, given every possible exit, and reached the final point where intervention was no longer a choice, but an obligation. The younger officer still had Chuck's arm locked painfully behind him, expecting him to wince or struggle. He didn't realize he was the one being set up, not as the captor, but as the first target. He leaned in again, voice thick with smugness. You gonna file a complaint now, tough guy? You gonna tell the judge we hurt your little bike? Chuck looked down at the ground, not in surrender, but in calculation. The gravel beneath his boots, the weight of the officer behind him, the position of the older one in front. Everything was now information, not intimidation. He spoke calmly, the same line he had given before, only now it carried a different weight. Last chance. Stop before this goes somewhere you can't walk back from. The younger officer scoffed. Is that supposed to scare? He didn't finish the sentence. Chuck moved, not violently, not wildly, but with the kind of precision that only came from thousands of hours spent learning where a body breaks and how to stop a fight before it begins. His elbow snapped back, not to strike, but to catch the younger officer's grip at the exact angle where the wrist lost leverage. In the same breath, Chuck shifted his weight, turned half a step, and used the officer's own locked stance against him. The arm that had been held behind him became a fulcrum. The younger officer's own momentum completed the throw. In less than a heartbeat, the officer was on the ground, face down, his arm twisted into a hold that no amount of strength could escape without tearing ligaments. The older officer reacted with the speed of a man used to violence, but not used to being on the losing end of it. He lunged forward, hand reaching for his holster, not out of necessity, but out of panic. Chuck didn't give him the chance to draw. A sharp step forward, a palm strike to the inside of the forearm, and the holster arm failed. Fingers went numb. The gun never cleared the leather. The older officer stumbled, trying to catch breath that refused to come. Chuck didn't let him recover. He struck again, not a punch, but a clean, controlled blow to the diaphragm that emptied the man's lungs and stole his ability to speak or shout for backup. The officer hunched over, dropping to a knee, wheezing soundlessly like a machine that had lost power. The younger officer tried to get up. Chuck shifted, released him, then disabled him again with a simple downward strike to the shoulder, a move that shut down the arm without breaking bone. The man's scream was sharp, startled, not from agony, but from disbelief. He was no longer controlling the situation. He was no longer standing. He was no longer the threat. The fight didn't last long because it wasn't a fight. It was a demonstration. The older officer made one last desperate move, reaching for his radio this time, maybe believing that if he could not win with strength, he could still win with narrative. Chuck caught his wrist before it reached the button. A twist, a pivot, and a controlled takedown sent the man across the hood of the cruiser. Metal shook. Breath failed again. The radio remained untouched. Chuck didn't gloat, didn't kick, didn't shout. Instead, he spoke in the same calm tone he had used hours earlier when he first asked them to stop littering. "You're both alive. You're both conscious. That means you still have a chance to learn something from this. But you need to understand, what you did tonight wasn't power. It was cowardice wearing a badge." The younger officer, pinned in the dirt, spit blood and dust. "You're gonna pay for this," he hissed. "We'll say you attacked us. You resisted arrest. You tried to grab a weapon. You're done." Chuck let him finish, then answered quietly. "You don't understand. You're still thinking I'm afraid of the report. I'm not." He reached into the open cruiser, not for a weapon, but for the dashboard-mounted camera, checking its indicator. It was on just like most patrol vehicles, unless manually disabled. He adjusted the angle slightly, turning it toward the scene. "Your report won't matter," he said, "because I'm not the one who's going to write the truth about tonight." He pulled out his phone, opened the camera, and began recording everything: their bruises, the bike on the ground, the scratches, the boot print in the dirt where he'd been kicked, the badge numbers, the location on screen, the cruiser number, the timestamp. He narrated calmly, not for drama, for evidence. "This is Highway 87 southbound. 2 officers from Precinct 12. Timestamp 1943. They damaged my motorcycle, initiated physical force without lawful basis, and threatened false charges. I defended myself. They are injured but conscious. Medical assistance will be requested." The older officer tried to push himself upright again, but Chuck placed one hand on his shoulder, not as punishment, but as restraint. "Don't move. The more you move, the worse this looks for you." The officer's voice was hoarse, windless. "You don't get to tell me," Chuck didn't raise his tone. "Right now, I'm the only one who's made decisions that don't end with someone dead. So yes, I do." He stepped back, letting both men breathe without letting either rise. Then he made the call not to local dispatch, not to the same system that had enabled them, but to a number only few people ever used, the division that did not answer to the badge, but to the law that stood above it. Internal Affairs. He gave the location, the summary, the confirmation that both officers were alive and restrained. And only then did he end the call. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He stood in full view of the road, the fallen bike behind him, 2 officers incapacitated but alive on the ground, the patrol lights still glowing across the dirt like the last flicker of authority fading into the dark. And for the first time all night, silence didn't belong to the officers. It belonged to Chuck. Not because he was stronger, but because he had finally given them the one thing they spent their careers avoiding: accountability. Far in the distance, sirens began to rise. Not theirs, not called by them, but coming for them. And for the first time, they sensed it. They weren't the men in control anymore. They were the men who would have to answer. The sirens grew louder long before the lights appeared, a wavering rise in the distance that did not bring relief to the two officers on the ground. For the first time that night, their expressions changed, not to anger, not to indignation, but to something far quieter and far more human: doubt. They had assumed every response would belong to their network, their station, their brothers in uniform. They had expected backup, not oversight. They were used to being reinforced, not investigated. Chuck stood exactly where he had been when he ended the call, neither pacing nor looming over them. He didn't need to. The stillness itself was a form of control, unmoving, unshaken, unafraid. His phone rested in his hand, not like a weapon, but like a record. The cruiser's dash camera light blinked steadily, documenting everything the officers believed could be erased by paperwork. The first vehicle that arrived wasn't a patrol car, but an unmarked black sedan, its headlights cutting across the scene with surgical precision. Two men stepped out, then a third. Their clothing was plain, but the badges clipped to their belts were distinct internal affairs, or more formally, the Bureau of Professional Standards. They didn't hurry when they walked. Men who dealt with lies for a living never rushed toward truth. They collected it in layers, one fact at a time. Behind them, a second vehicle arrived, this one a patrol unit from another district. The officers inside already briefed enough to arrive neutral, not defensive. No one approached with weapons drawn. No one yelled commands at Chuck. The entire energy of the moment had shifted. Whatever the officers on the ground expected, this was not it. The lead IA agent approached Chuck first, offering a calm nod but no assumption of blame or innocence. "Are you the reporting party?" Chuck handed him the phone with the video paused on the timestamp and location display. "I recorded everything after they started damaging my motorcycle. The cruiser's dash camera has more. They initiated force without lawful cause. I defended myself and restrained them without lethal injury." The agent didn't react with surprise. He didn't ask why Chuck had fought back. He asked the only relevant question. "Are either of them in need of medical assistance?" Chuck gestured to both men. "They're conscious, breathing. No broken bones. They'll need shoulder and wrist exams. And one of them took a blow to the diaphragm. He may have trouble breathing until he recovers." The agent gave a single nod, turned to his team, and issued quiet instructions. The officers on the ground were not approached like heroes who had survived a confrontation. They were approached like crime scenes. The younger officer tried to speak first, voice shaking, not from pain, but from the realization that the script he depended on was no longer the one being followed. "He assaulted us," he blurted. "He resisted arrest. He attacked us without warning." The IA agent didn't even look at him. "Do not speak until your legal representative is present. You are not required to give a statement at this time." The words landed hard. They weren't accustomed to hearing the Miranda language spoken against them. The older officer, still leaning against the cruiser, tried a different tactic. "He ambushed us. We tried to run a check. He refused to cooperate." The agent finally turned to him, not with sympathy, but with a question that stripped away the comfort of lies. "Is that statement fully consistent with the cruiser's camera footage, your body mic logs, and the time-stamped injuries recorded on both parties?" The officer opened his mouth, but no words came, because for the first time, the evidence wasn't theirs to shape. Chuck stood silently as the agents photographed the scene, marked the positions of the fallen bike in the trash pile, measured the scrape along the fuel tank where a pen had been dragged, and documented the boot prints still stamped into the dirt beside him. Every detail that had once been ignored by the officers was now preserved by professionals who were trained not to look away. Medical responders arrived next, not in screaming urgency, but in quiet legality. They examined the two officers first, since detained individuals required priority assessment. Both would walk, both would heal, both would testify, but neither would forget that the moment they thought they owned had slipped out of their hands forever. The IA agent returned to Chuck. "You said you were traveling home?" "Yes," Chuck replied. "Do you need transportation? We can arrange towing for the motorcycle if you prefer." Chuck shook his head. It still runs. I'll take care of it. Then after a beat added, I don't need anything from the department, just the truth. The agent studied him for a quiet moment, not with admiration, not with hostility, but with something like respect. The kind reserved for people who didn't ask for revenge, only accuracy. You'll be contacted for a formal interview. I recommend you retain counsel, though your recording and the dash footage are unusually thorough. Chuck didn't say that he recorded out of principle, not strategy. He didn't need to. The agent continued, For what it's worth, Mr. Norris, this isn't the first complaint involving these officers, but it may be the first one that won't disappear. The weight of that landed not on Chuck, but on the men who heard it. The investigation on site took nearly an hour. Every officer present had to sign off on logs, evidence transfers, and chain of custody documentation, something the two patrolmen had spent years avoiding because nobody had ever forced it on them. Now their own procedures were being used against them, not as cruelty, but as justice. Only once everything was properly sealed and recorded did the agent step back. The night had grown darker, the sky fully reclaimed by stars, the air cool enough to mist with breath. The scene no longer resembled the place where an abuse of power occurred. It resembled the place where it ended. Chuck picked up his motorcycle, righted it, checked the engine casing for cracks. The mirror was bent but fixable. The paint was scratched but not destroyed. Nothing about the damage would stop the bike from running. Nothing about the damage would stop the truth from moving forward either. Before he mounted the bike, he looked once at the officers, not with triumph or anger or satisfaction, but with something simpler and harder to carry. Pity, because whatever sentence they received in court would pale compared to the one they had given themselves, living long enough to know that they weren't feared anymore. They were exposed. One of the IA agents stepped closer as Chuck adjusted his gloves. We'll be sending you a copy of the body cam footage and the full case file once it's processed. You won't need to chase it. Chuck nodded. Good. Anything else you want on record before you leave? Chuck glanced at the damaged bike, at the scattered trash still beside the cruiser, at the two officers sitting in the dirt where they had believed no consequences could reach them. There's nothing more to add, he said. Everything that needed to be seen is already on camera. He started the engine. The rumble filled the silence, not as rebellion, but as closure. Then he said the line only the night would hear. The road doesn't lie. People do, but not for long. And he rode away, not as a victor, not as a fugitive, but as a man who had done exactly what needed to be done, and nothing more. Behind him, the scene remained lit by official lights instead of police ones. For the first time, the law wasn't following him. It was following them. The courtroom was quieter than anyone expected. No crowd, no loud press, no spectacle. Just the low hum of fluorescent lights, the rustle of papers, and the quiet tension that always carries more weight than shouting ever could. The two officers sat at the defense table in formal uniforms that no longer felt like symbols of authority, but like costumes borrowed from another life. Their badges had been removed weeks earlier, pending the outcome of the investigation. What remained on their chests were clean outlines where the metal ones hung, like ghosts of power they could no longer claim. Their attorney whispered urgently, but neither man seemed to be listening. Both of them stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on nothing, as if trying to find the version of the world where this wasn't happening. The older officer's jaw remained clenched, the stiffness of a man still refusing to believe consequences could exist for him. The younger one looked different. The bravado he wore so easily on the roadside had eroded. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't mocking. He was scared because the world had shifted from one where he could lie and win to one where evidence had a louder voice than he did. The prosecutor presented the case with the calm precision of someone who didn't need passion to win only facts. The courtroom watched dash cam footage, paused at the moment where the younger officer bent the mirror, watched again as the bike fell, watched again as the kick landed to Chuck's face, watched again as the officers made verbal threats they believed would never be heard outside the darkness of the roadside. Every time the footage resumed, the defense shrank a little more into their chairs. It was not Chuck's testimony that sealed the case. It was the officers' own voices, recorded without their awareness, preserving everything they thought could be rewritten later. The phrase they'd used with such confidence, "We'll say he resisted, and no one will believe him," now stood in court as their undoing. What they thought was power had become evidence. Chuck's testimony was brief, not dramatic. He answered every question with clarity, never embellishing, never injecting emotion. He didn't speak of fear, only of fact. He didn't call them corrupt, only stated what had happened. He didn't express anger about his bike, or about the kick, or the threats. He simply told the truth, with a steadiness that made exaggeration unnecessary. When asked why he didn't strike first, his answer was simple. Because I wasn't defending myself from danger. I was defending myself from people abusing their authority. That's not the same thing. I gave them chances to stop. The judge asked a final question that wasn't part of the formal examination. "Why didn't you walk away?" Chuck replied. "Because if I walked away, they would have done it to someone who couldn't fight back. I just happened to be the wrong man to pick." That answer settled into the room like a final stone. The verdict came without delay. Both officers were convicted multiple charges, including abuse of authority, falsification of official reports, and assault under color of law. They were sentenced not to suspension or fines, but to actual time prison, not administrative holding. Their pensions were revoked. Their right to wear a badge again was permanently stripped. The older officer heard the sentence and didn't flinch, but his jaw finally loosened, not in relief but in acceptance. The younger one stared forward, eyes wet, no longer trying to hide it. Their punishment was not only the time they would serve, but the knowledge that the system they believed they owned had turned and spoken back. Chuck stayed through the sentencing, not because he needed closure, but because seeing the process through was part of respecting the system they tried to corrupt. He left the courtroom the same way he had entered it, quietly, without celebration, without triumph. Outside, the air felt different, not lighter but cleaner. Justice never erased what came before. It only prevented it from continuing. He didn't stay for reporters. There weren't many anyway. Stories like this didn't attract the crowds that scandals did. There was no trending headline, no viral montage, no documentary crew waiting to give him a heroic arc. There was just the road again. The motorcycle was waiting at a small repair garage outside town. The mechanic had done more than fix the damage. He had restored the bike almost lovingly. The paint had been repolished, the mirror replaced, the side panels buffed until they reflected the sky. Chuck tried to pay him, but the man refused. "Community covered it," he said. "People pitched in, said they wanted the bike back on the road." Chuck ran a hand along the tank, studying the repair. It looked new but not perfect. A faint line remained where the scratch had been. Not sloppy work, but deliberate. The mechanic noticed his glance. "Left that one on purpose," he said. "Figured it's not a bad thing to remember." Chuck nodded. "It's not." He rode out of the lot without fanfare, the engine steady, the wind familiar, the horizon wide open again. But something had changed. Not in him, in the world he left behind. In the weeks that followed, procedural changes were introduced in the station where the officers had worked. Body cameras were now required to stay active during all civilian interactions, not optional. Supervisors reviewed recordings randomly instead of only during complaints. A community oversight panel was added, small but real. Officers whispered about the case not with resentment, but with caution. The message was clear. The badge no longer erased accountability. It now required it. A month later, someone sent Chuck a photo. Volunteers, kids, retirees, truck drivers had cleaned the roadside where the first confrontation happened. The trash was gone. A sign stood where the cruiser once idled, not official, just hand-painted. "Leave the road better than you found it." Nobody signed their name to it. They didn't have to. Some changes didn't need credit. They just needed witnesses. Chuck didn't reply to the photo. He simply looked at it once, breathed in the quiet, and kept writing. He didn't need applause or recognition or headlines. He just needed the road. And the knowledge that, at least this time, doing the right thing didn't end in silence. It ended in consequence. The kind the world sees, not the kind it buries. He opened the throttle just enough to feel the response of the engine, the hum of rubber meeting asphalt, the rhythm of a life lived forward. The road didn't ask for anything, and he asked nothing from it. That was the agreement. not written in law books, written in men, and still obeyed by the ones who understood it.